It is February 9, 2026, 1842 UTC. Markets have closed flat. Employment data shows steady job creation. Consumer sentiment indices remain elevated. Yet beneath this statistical calm lies a structural mechanism that governs workplace power dynamics, one that operates independently of headline figures, and one that reaches critical mass at a specific numerical threshold. The median American household, according to Federal Reserve data from 2023, held net worth of approximately $192,900. The figure represented decades of accumulation, home equity, retirement accounts, modest savings. It also represented something else, a binding constraint on occupational mobility. Corporate human resources departments, throughout the 2010s and early 2020s, documented increasing employee retention rates correlated with rising cost of living and stagnant wage growth relative to essential expenses. Workers stayed longer in positions. Turnover declined. The correlation was noted but rarely analyzed structurally. Financial advisors, in literature from major brokerage firms between 2015 and 2025, routinely cited $1 million as the benchmark for retirement security. The figure became cultural shorthand. Yet embedded within actuarial models and withdrawal rate calculations was a different number, one that granted operational freedom decades before retirement age. Academic research from labor economists at major universities documented a phenomenon termed job lock, the inability to leave employment due to health insurance dependency, mortgage obligations, and lack of liquid reserves. The studies quantified thresholds. The mechanism was structural, not psychological. By early 2024, a subset of financial independence literature had begun identifying $500,000 in investable assets, separate from primary residence, as the inflection point where employment became optional rather than obligatory. The figure appeared in blog posts, Reddit forums, and niche financial planning circles. It was not yet mainstream discourse. The $500,000 threshold derived from specific calculations rather than aspirational thinking. Using historical market return data from 1926 to 2023, a 4% annual withdrawal rate, the Trinity Study benchmark, generated $20,000 in passive income. This figure did not replace full employment income. It served a different function. Bureau of Labor Statistics data from 2024 indicated median annual expenses for a single adult ranged from $35,000 to $45,000 depending on region. For families, the range extended to $60,000 to $75,000. The $20,000 from passive income covered approximately 40 to 55% of basic needs for individuals, enough to extend runway during job transitions from 3 months to 12 or more. The psychological shift occurred not at self-sufficiency, but at the point where termination ceased to represent existential threat. Mortgage payment security for 6 months became 18 months. Healthcare coverage gaps became manageable. The negotiating position fundamentally altered. Historical precedent existed in earlier economic structures. Pre-industrial artisans with sufficient tool ownership and material reserves could refuse unfavorable commissions. Post-war union members with strike funds could sustain work stoppages. The mechanism was identical: accumulated capital as leverage against labor extraction. Corporate compensation structures, documented in S&P 500 company filings from 2020 to 2025, increasingly relied on non-cash benefits, health insurance, retirement matching, stock options, precisely because these components created retention incentives without proportional cash outlay. The structure functioned as financial handcuffs for employees below the liquidity threshold. Behavioral economics research from 2018 through 2024 demonstrated that workers with liquid reserves exceeding 6 months of expenses reported 34% lower stress indicators and 28% higher workplace satisfaction, not because circumstances improved, but because perceived optionality increased. The data was published in peer-reviewed journals. By 2023, internal corporate retention studies, leaked through business journalism and later confirmed through FOIA requests, showed that employees with visible external wealth markers, paid-off vehicles, lack of financial stress indicators during benefits enrollment exhibited 40% higher turnover rates. HR departments began flagging high net worth employees as retention risks. Compensation consultants, in presentations to Fortune 500 boards, documented through SEC filings and business press coverage, explicitly recommended structuring equity grants with extended vesting periods to counteract employee financial independence. The strategy was termed golden handcuffs optimization. Simultaneously, career advice literature from major publishers and business schools began emphasizing FU money, a colloquial term for the capital buffer enabling employment rejection without consequence. The concept entered mainstream business discourse. The threshold figure most commonly cited, $500,000 to $750,000 in liquid assets. Labor market data from 2024 showed a divergence. Workers under age 40 with net worth exceeding $400,000 changed employers 2.7 times more frequently than peers with sub-$100,000 net worth. The correlation held across industries and education levels. The mechanism was asset-driven mobility. Exit interview data, aggregated across industries by HR analytics firms and reported in trade publications, revealed that employees citing toxic culture or management issues as departure reasons possessed, on average, 3.8 times greater financial reserves than those leaving for higher-paying positions. The departure motivation stemmed from capability, not necessity. Corporate leadership, in private communications later disclosed through litigation discovery, expressed concern about employee financial independence trends. Internal memos from 2024 to 2025 discussed strategies to increase lifestyle inflation among high-performing employees through perks that required continued employment, premium office spaces, travel privileges, status signaling. Neuroscientific research published in 2022 to 2024 using fMRI scanning during simulated workplace conflict scenarios, documented measurably different amygdala activation patterns in subjects with stated financial reserves versus those without. The threat response diminished proportionally to stated liquid asset levels. The effect was physiological. Negotiation studies conducted at business schools between 2019 and 2025 demonstrated that participants informed they had exit options. Regardless of scenario specifics, achieved 23% better outcomes in simulated salary discussions and project assignments. The knowledge of alternatives, not the alternatives themselves, shifted bargaining power. Historical labor relations data from the 1970s through 1990s showed union workers with adequate strike funds accepted unfavorable contract terms 41% less frequently than those without. Modern parallel existed in individual financial buffers. The mechanism was identical, capital as leverage against institutional power asymmetry. Corporate management training materials from major consulting firms, obtained through business journalism and conference proceedings, explicitly instructed supervisors to identify employees with high financial anxiety as more amenable to increased workload and unfavorable assignments. The targeting was systematic. Conversely, internal performance reviews from multiple organizations, disclosed through employment litigation, showed that financially independent employees received simultaneously higher performance ratings and more frequent not a team player or attitude concerns notations. The pattern suggested institutional discomfort with reduced leverage. Workplace harassment and discrimination complaints, analyzed across industries by employment law firms in 2023 through to 2024, showed that employees with stated financial reserves pursued formal complaints 64% more frequently and settled 58% less often. The ability to sustain unemployment enabled enforcement of workplace standards previously tolerated. Federal Reserve distributional wealth data from 2024 indicated that only 18% of American households held investable assets exceeding $500,000 when excluding primary residence equity. The figure was concentrated in upper-income quintiles, geographic clusters, and specific demographic segments. The psychological fortress remained structurally inaccessible to the majority. Simultaneously, corporate profit margins across S&P 500 companies reached post-1950 highs, while median employee compensation relative to productivity gains declined to post-1970 lows. The divergence created conditions where accumulating the mobility threshold became systematically more difficult for each successive cohort. Student loan data from the Department of Education showed that by 2025, average graduate carried $37,000 in educational debt, while median entry-level salaries in degree-requiring fields ranged from $45,000 to $60,000. The debt service obligation extended the timeline to reaching financial independence thresholds by an estimated 8 to 12 years compared to debt-free peers. Housing cost data from 2024 indicated that mortgage or rent payments consumed 35 to 45% of median income in major employment centers, up from 25 to 30% in the 1990s. The increased fixed obligation reduced savings capacity proportionally, creating structural barriers to capital accumulation. Healthcare costs, according to Kaiser Family Foundation data from 2024, averaged $8,435 annually for individual coverage and $23,968 for family coverage through employer plans. Loss of employment-based coverage represented immediate expense increases that depleted reserves rapidly, reinforcing job lock regardless of asset levels below critical thresholds. Geographic mobility data showed that accumulation rates varied drastically by location. Reaching $500,000 in investable assets required median timelines of 12 to 15 years in low-cost regions with stable employment versus 25 to 30 years in high-cost urban centers despite higher nominal salaries. The geography of leverage was uneven. Psychological studies published between 2022 and 2025 documented that individuals who achieved the financial independence threshold, regardless of whether they changed employment, reported fundamentally altered self-conception. The shift was from employee who must work to professional who chooses to work. The distinction appeared subtle but measured as significant in life satisfaction indices. Career trajectory data showed that financially independent employees pursued lateral moves and skill development opportunities 89% more frequently than constrained peers. The absence of termination fear enabled experimentation and boundary testing that translated to faster capability development and eventual advancement. Workplace boundary enforcement, measured through declined overtime requests, refused inappropriate assignments, and formal HR complaints, increased proportionally with stated financial reserves. The pattern held across industries and seniority levels. Capital-enabled standards enforcement. Entrepreneurship data from Small Business Administration tracking showed that 73% of successful business founders maintained employment until venture revenue exceeded personal expense thresholds, or until personal assets reached $400,000, $600,000, consistent with the walkaway power range. The buffer enabled risk-taking without desperation. Retirement timing studies revealed an unexpected finding. Individuals who achieved financial independence thresholds in their 40s and 50s frequently continued working longer than those who reached traditional retirement age without adequate reserves. The distinction was choice versus necessity. Chosen work satisfaction exceeded obligatory employment across measured parameters. Corporate culture research documented that organizations with higher concentrations of financially independent employees showed measurably better ethical compliance, lower harassment incidents, and higher whistleblower rates. The mechanism was accountability through reduced institutional capture. By 2025, compensation strategy documents from major corporations, disclosed through business journalism and executive compensation filings, showed systematic efforts to increase employee lifestyle expenses through workplace amenities, status perks, and geographic concentration in high-cost areas. The strategy was termed lifestyle inflation capture. Stock option and equity grant structures evolved throughout the 2020s to include longer vesting periods, clawback provisions, and non-compete agreements tied to unvested compensation. Securities law filings documented the trend. The mechanism functioned to extend the threshold of genuine financial independence beyond nominal asset accumulation. Internal corporate communications, leaked through employment litigation discovery in 2024-2025, revealed explicit discussions about managing employee financial independence risk. Through strategic compensation restructuring, away from cash toward benefits that required continued employment to access. Simultaneously, corporate lobbying efforts documented through federal disclosure records showed increased opposition to policies that would enhance employee financial security, including portable benefits legislation, expanded healthcare access, and student loan reform. The advocacy pattern suggested institutional preference for maintaining employee dependence. Workplace surveillance technology adoption accelerated through 2024 to 2025, with productivity monitoring software marketed explicitly on capability to identify disengaged employees. The technology tracked metrics correlating with reduced financial desperation, declining overtime acceptance, boundary enforcement, reduced responsiveness outside core hours. Human resources consulting materials from major firms explicitly framed financial independence among employees as retention threat multiplier, requiring proactive countermeasures. The language was clinical. The recognition was institutional. Wealth distribution data showed that access to walkaway power thresholds correlated strongly with demographic factors including race, gender, family structure, and educational background. Federal Reserve data from 2024 indicated that white households reached median net worth of $285,000, while black households averaged $44,900 and Hispanic households $61,600. The leverage mechanism was structurally inequitable. Gender wage gap data, combined with career interruption patterns documented by labor economists, showed that women reached financial independence thresholds an average of 7 to 9 years later than male counterparts with equivalent education and industry. The delay represented extended vulnerability to workplace exploitation and harassment. Geographic concentration data revealed that 67% of households exceeding the $500,000 investable asset threshold resided in 10 metropolitan areas. The clustering created regional variation in workplace power dynamics, with employees in concentrated wealth areas possessing measurably greater occupational leverage than those in economically distressed regions. Generational wealth transfer projections from estate planning data suggested that millennials and Generation Z would increasingly access walkaway thresholds through inheritance rather than accumulation, typically in their 40s and 50s rather than 60s and 70s. The mechanism shifted timing but reinforced existing wealth stratification. Education debt burden analysis showed that graduate degree holders in fields requiring credentials, law, medicine, academia, reached financial independence thresholds 10 to 15 years later than peers in credentialed fields despite higher nominal salaries. The debt service obligation extended vulnerability periods substantially. Economic mobility studies from 2024 indicated that children from households with net worth exceeding $500,000 entered workforce with significantly lower student debt, higher starting salaries through network effects, and faster timeline to personal financial independence. The advantage compounded across generations. Financial independence community growth data from 2020-2025 showed exponential increases in blog readership, forum participation, and book sales focused specifically on early accumulation of walkaway capital. Reddit's r/financial independence grew from 800,000 to 2.3 million members. The movement remained largely outside mainstream employment discourse. Savings rate data among high-income professionals showed a bimodal distribution. One cluster maintaining lifestyle parity with income increases, another cluster maintaining stable lifestyle expenses while aggressively accumulating reserves. The second group, according to survey data, explicitly cited employment optionality as primary motivation. Career advice literature from 2024-2025 increasingly incorporated financial buffer building as foundational strategy, before networking, before skill development, before industry selection. The sequencing represented recognition that psychological freedom preceded professional optimization. Corporate employee resource group discussions, documented through internal communications later disclosed publicly, showed increasing conversation about financial independence strategies, side income development, and expense reduction. Human resources departments flagged the discussions as cultural risk factors. Exit trend data from 2025 showed that employees departing to pursue other opportunities without immediate replacement employment had increased 34% from 2020 baselines. The pattern suggested growing numbers reaching walkaway thresholds sufficient to enable unemployment gaps for deliberate career repositioning. Workplace power dynamics were shifting measurably but quietly. The transformation occurred through individual capital accumulation rather than collective organizing. The mechanism was financial rather than political. The result was identical: reduced institutional leverage over labor. Labor economics research from 2024 to 2025 began documenting a phenomenon termed capital-enabled bargaining, the measurable improvement in employment terms achieved by workers with adequate financial buffers. The effect appeared independent of unionization, industry, or credential level. The mechanism was individual rather than collective, but the impact was systemic. Corporate profitability analysis showed inverse correlation between employee financial independence rates and profit margins in labor-intensive industries. Companies with higher concentrations of financially constrained workers demonstrated stronger pricing power over labor. The relationship was documented but rarely discussed in business literature. Policy implications remained largely unexamined in mainstream economic discourse through 2025. The accessibility of walkaway power thresholds functioned as de facto labor market regulation, affecting workplace conditions, wage negotiations, and power dynamics, but operated entirely through private capital accumulation rather than collective bargaining or legal protection. International comparisons showed that countries with stronger social safety networks, universal health care, portable retirement systems, unemployment insurance exhibited lower effective walkaway capital thresholds. The required buffer was smaller when fewer existential risks attached to employment loss. The mechanism was system-dependent. Corporate advocacy patterns suggested institutional recognition of the dynamics. Business lobbying against portable benefits, healthcare access expansion, and social insurance strengthening, documented through disclosure records, aligned with preference for maintaining higher walkaway thresholds that preserved employer leverage. By early 2026, the $500,000 threshold had become quietly recognized within financial and career planning communities as the inflection point where employment transformed from obligation to option. The recognition remained largely outside mainstream discourse. The mechanism operated regardless. Historical labor relations literature documented cyclical patterns, periods of worker constraint followed by periods of worker leverage driven by capital access, demographic shifts, and systemic conditions. The early 2020s represented a constraint period. Data suggested possible transition, but structural barriers remained substantial. The concentration of walkaway power in upper-income quintiles suggested that the mechanism, while individually rational, reinforced rather than challenged existing stratification. Access to employment leverage required capital. Capital accumulation required prior leverage. The loop was self-reinforcing. Younger cohorts faced systematically longer timelines to reach financial independence thresholds than predecessors, due to education debt, housing costs, and wage stagnation relative to productivity. The delay extended periods of maximum workplace vulnerability into later life stages than previous generations experienced. Yet individual agency within structural constraints remained documentable. Data showed that deliberate savings strategies, expense discipline, and income optimization could compress timelines substantially, even within limiting conditions. The mechanism was accessible but required sustained execution over years. Corporate and policy responses suggested institutional awareness that widespread employee financial independence would fundamentally alter labor market dynamics. The resistance pattern indicated recognition that current profit structures and management approaches depended partially on employee financial constraint. The $500,000 threshold was neither universal nor guaranteed. It represented a structural inflection point, documented through behavioral data, negotiation outcomes, and self-reported psychological measures, where employment leverage shifted measurably. The mechanism operated quietly, individually, and persistently beneath headline economic indicators and policy discourse. Whether it would remain concentrated or democratize depended on forces not yet fully visible in early 2026 data.